Hi, so my name is Esmeralda Lopez, and today I will be talking about my paper, Factors Associated with Public Support for the Colombian Peace Agreement, an Exploration of Trust and Violence. So before we discuss public support for the Colombian Peace Agreement, I'd like to talk about the Colombian Conflict, which is what the Colombian Peace Agreement addresses. So the armed conflict in Colombia began in 1964 with the creation of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, are a guerrilla insurgent group that began in Colombia as a way of protecting and advocating for rural and lower class voices, these marginalized groups within Colombia, but has also been known as the instigator for many human rights violations, including but not limited to homicide, kidnappings, the recruitment of child soldiers, sexual violence, and participation in the drug trade. So in the 1990s and early 2000s, there was an intensification of the conflict between Colombia and the FARC. And so it was within that context of that intensifying conflict that President Uribe was elected president in Colombia. And he chose to take a hard stance against the FARC, meaning that he had heavy military use against the FARC. And though he was able to whittle down some of their forces, he was ultimately unable to stop the FARC in its entirety. And so the conflict continued. So then after he served his 2 terms, in 2010, President Santos was elected in Colombia, and he began negotiation. So he took a completely different approach to addressing the conflict than Uribe, and his approach ended up being successful in that in 2016, Colombia and the FARC were able to come to an agreement on the peace agreement. And at the Colombian government's preference, the agreement was put to a public referendum so that the public could vote as to whether or not the peace agreement would be passed. And so in early October of 2016, the peace agreement failed to pass by a narrow margin through that referendum. So the Colombian negotiators and the FARC negotiators continued sort of discussing the terms of the negotiation of the peace agreement. And in late November, the legislature chose to pass the peace agreement. So with that, I'd like to talk about how we can anticipate support for the for the peace agreement. So this is essentially my literature review and hypotheses. So as the title of my paper suggests, I'll be talking about trust and violence. So speaking first towards trust in government institutions and beginning with the legislature. In 2016, there was indication that the people did not trust their Congress in Colombia. There was a lot of suspicion associated with the peace agreement and with congressional involvement in the peace agreement. Essentially, the attitude that many held was that, yes, we want peace, but no, we do not want peace like this. So therefore, I predicted that with greater trust in the legislature, a person would be more likely to support the peace agreement. Then looking to the executive, we can see that there was polarization of the peace agreement with the approaches of Uribe and Santos, those past presidents in Colombia, and other research had been able to demonstrate that the opinion that a person holds of each specific president could potentially indicate their support for the peace agreement. So keeping that in mind, we sort of expanded on that idea to say that if the individual president matters, then the executive office as a whole would then matter. So that with greater trust in the executive, a person would be more likely to support the peace agreement. Then looking to trust in the judiciary, we have seen a large preference for retributive justice and punitive measures against ex-combatants. That is to say that people wanted to see these ex-combatants pay for the crimes that they committed or pay for the crimes that their groups committed. And so with a person who has more trust in the judiciary, there's likely going to be a greater belief that the judiciary will deal out these punitive measures, and therefore that person is more likely to support the peace agreement, or so we theorized. So then to continue with these government institutions, we have trust in elections. So there's a relationship between perceived corruption and low voter turnout in Colombia. And to expand upon that, we determined, or rather we hypothesized that with greater trust in the elections, so with a person believing that there is less corruption, with having that greater trust in elections, they would then be more likely to support the peace agreement. Then to discuss the perception of the FARC, and more specifically, this is the trust in the FARC and the belief in Farc demobilization. And of course, the belief in Farc demobilization is really just a function of trust in the FARC. So for trust in the FARC, there was widespread disapproval of the FARC reintegration provisions of the peace agreement. So these reintegration provisions, at least the most hotly contested, were ones that allowed the FARC to be involved in Colombia's government. So the FARC could create its own political party. And in addition to being able to create its own political party, that FARC political party would have a set number of representatives in Colombia's legislature. And a lot of people really did not like that, and truthfully did not like the FARC as a whole. So if a person has greater trust in the FARC, we believed that they would be less likely to contest these peace agreements to contest those provisions, and therefore be more likely to support the peace agreement. Then to look at Farc Demobilization, one of the big successes of the peace agreement for the Colombian government was that they had negotiated for the quick disarmament of the FARC. That is, that the FARC combatants would lay down arms within a timely period. But if a person does not believe that the FARC will demobilize, then these provisions are effectively meaningless. So then we believe that stronger belief in demobilization will lead a person to be more likely to support the peace agreement. And then lastly, we're looking at proximity to violence. So this is just whether or not a person lives in an area that experiences a lot of violence. And so with the proximity to violence variable, we see that there was a lot of death and devastation associated with the Colombian armed conflict, as it was a conflict that lasted for 52 years. And so during that time, the areas of Colombia that were hit most hard were the rural areas and areas that were already marginalized areas, low income areas. And so because of that, those parts of Colombia that were hit hardest by the violence and by the real effects of the conflict would need a way for the violence to end. And so we believed that with greater proximity to that violence, a person would be more likely to support the peace agreement so that the conflict could come to a close. And so in order to test these hypotheses, I prepared a multinomial logistic regression clustered by municipality using data from the Americas Barometer conducted by the Latin American Public Opinion Poll in 2016. We chose data from 2016 so that it would reflect the time period of the referendum. And so this regression that I've created measures the trust and violence variables, which are my independent variables, against the support for the peace agreement, which is my dependent variable. And so here to look at the model that I've created, we can see that looking at all of the trust and violence variables, these coefficients are positive. And so looking at these positive coefficients, this indicates that there's a positive relationship between all of the trust and the violence and support for the peace agreement. And this supports my hypotheses that increased trust and increased proximity to violence will mean increased support for the peace agreement. Then we can also see that almost all of my variables here are statistically significant. The only one that is not is trust in the national legislature, though it is approaching significance. Then you can also see that I tested for some demographic control variables like ethnicity, gender, level of education, and income. But again, looking at these p-values, none of these demographic control variables were statistically significant. So then it's using this model, which measured 1,238 responses, that we were able to account for about 31% of why a person would support the peace agreement. And so in conclusion, we see that there's a positive relationship between trust and violence variables and support for the peace agreement. We also know that the control variables are not statistically significant within this model. And ultimately, what this demonstrates is that trust in government institutions and trust in the FARC is really just a reflection of the public's belief as to whether the government and the FARC will each be able to hold up their end of the peace agreement so that the peace agreement may be successfully implemented in Colombia. Thank you.
Wow. Yeah, very good.
Ooh.
Nice timing on that too. I got to tell you that's exactly what you want to do. Too many people spend too much time on their introduction, and you went right into it. So I think if everyone's okay, at least when I present, I don't hear anything other people say until after I'm done presenting. So could we go ahead and go to the next presenter with Cesar? And am I saying your name correctly?
Yeah, I don't have a preference really.
Okay,
Today, my presentation is going to cover Native American resistance to Anglo-Christian conversion efforts. You know, the question that I wanted to ask was, you know, between the 18th and 19th century, how did Native Americans resist this incoming force of Anglo-European conversion in the U.S.? This question kind of came about during a project that I had with in my class, my American Religious History class with Dr. Tomlin. And the reason why I wanted to focus on this in particular was because a lot of the history was focused on schism between different denominations of Christianity within the US. But I noticed that Native Americans were kind of left out a lot in the history. They were kind of squeezed in between that schism. So I wanted to cover that a little bit more in depth. And throughout my research, what I figured was that, you know, through their differing approaches to death, retaliating against encroachments into their territory and willingness to engage in religious and cultural dialogue, that's where Native Americans most commonly resisted these conversion efforts. But like another challenge that I had was, how am I going to define resistance, or how do I know for sure that this is a form of resistance? And, you know, I was looking initially for a more explicit way of an explicit example of resistance from these Native Americans. For instance, here, I have 3 instances of reverends, pastors, missionaries. They were all trying to move into these missions or these forts, trying to bring, you know, Christianity along with them, but they found themselves pushed out by Native American forces. And to me, that was a more explicit form of resistance. Here in particular with the Whitmans in the Oregon Territory, they were described as kind of having this perception that Native Americans in the area were an inferior race and that they were doomed at no distant day to give place to a settlement of enterprising Americans. So they were kind of using their conversion efforts as a way to kind of start encroaching on this territory and bringing forth that city on a hill mentality. But that was met with strong resistance by the Cayuse Indians in the area. And after a epidemic of measles came by, you know, coupling kind of this ulterior motive that the Whitmans had, plus you know, the measles epidemic and a cultural aspect to the Cayuse that apparently they attributed malevolent spirits to shamans who were unable to cure or heal their people, and they would kill them. That was the fate that befell the Whitmans and a couple other people. But to me, that resistance is explicit, and it seems obvious. But what I was hoping for was something else that didn't seem as obvious. And then throughout my explorations, I started to see that, oh, they don't just resist explicitly like that. They don't have to quite say outright or act outright against a religious denomination. There is an implicit form of resistance present during these 2 centuries that I discovered. An example here would be Indian Converts, written by Experienced Mayhew. He was detailing his conversion efforts in Martha's Vineyard, and he was converting the forgive me, it's hard for me to pronounce some of these groups' names, but the Wampanoags. He was converting them to Puritanism for a long time, and you know, he was sending these reports back home like, oh, look at my conversion efforts, how successful they are. Please send more funding so that we can continue this this process of conversion. But you know, even though that bias that Experienced Mayhew has on his report of making his conversion efforts look as good as possible, he notes that amongst these converts in deathbed scenes, that they experience these supernatural occurrences that aren't a usual aspect of Anglo-Christian thought or experience. This was a kind of an evolution of their own culture mingling with Puritanism during this time. And to me, that refusal to kind of let go of that element of how their old religious life was, to me, that implies an implicit resistance to these conversion efforts, like not totally converting to the proper Christian image that these missionaries had. And, you know, that was to me, that was the most exciting part of figuring out what this resistance story looked like. And then going into the dialogue, another form of that implicit resistance that I saw, you could see here with a plea to the court in 1871. Chippewa Indians were in court discussing the exploitation of their pine by a man named Mr. Smith. At this point, they were pushed into a reservation and they already had so little land to work with and not much compensation for it. And in this instance, they had a reverend named Reverend Johnson, who was a native convert who was Christianized for all intents and purposes, but he was speaking in the defense of the Chippewa Indians here in this instance. And he's incorporating these elements of their ties to the land, how we had made up our minds that we were born to it. And that the land itself is an important religious element to the Native American experience. And here the subtlety, that implicit form of resistance, using a converted native to make the argument that, hey, I am speaking your language in terms of I've kind of assimilated a little bit to your religious culture, but this is where my religious culture comes into this story too. And to me, again, an implicit form of resistance. It doesn't seem obviously religious, that it's just about land. Somebody might look at this and just say, oh, it's just about land. But no, that religious element of how the Native Americans are also tied to the land, to me, that implicit form of resistance is really important to notice. And ultimately, you know, given these other examples of explicit and implicit resistance, I also have one of my favorite examples was kind of an alliance between Native Americans and the French and the British during the 7 Years' War. That some people don't see the 7 Years' War as a religious conflict, but there are religious elements in it. We're French Catholic versus the English Protestant. In this instance, in relations to death, and you could also relate it to my other way that I saw Native Americans resisting through the offensive. You see that if by them picking a side between French Catholics or English Protestants, that is another kind of implicit message of, hey, we do not want this incursion, this conversion of into whatever religions we're trying to fight against into our land. That is like picking a side sends a message of yours is something I can't agree with, and I'm going to fight against it. So just by picking a side, that's another form of implicit resistance. They're kind of taking advantage of that French Catholic versus English Protestant butting of heads. And ultimately, you know, through death, through the offensive, through dialogue, you see that Native Americans have always found themselves on the defensive to protect what their culture, their religious experience. And to me, the reason why this is so important is that, like, we usually think of the Native American populations as just a conquered people, that they've been wiped out. But I feel like that element of resistance, even implicit resistance, it speaks to a spirit of empowerment, of strength in this culture that, to me, it's kind of heartwarming in a way to think about. And it applies to other indigenous groups across the world. And I feel like that's another part of history that we should really focus on. That's all the time I got. I hope that was fluid.
It is, and for your first presentation, that's pretty awesome. And also being able to use the graphics that way to pop in and out is also very awesome. And yeah, Wampanoags is a mouthful. In general, in American Indian, go for the ah sound. Ah, in general, will pull you through a lot of difficult situations. So good job. Let's move on. Whoops, next to Lauren Putnam.
So during my time at UNT, I took quite a few environmental classes, and when discussing issues about climate change, the discussions usually centered around systems and government. And then that left me wondering, like, how much does that absolve me of guilt as an individual for my carbon footprint and my environmental harm if changing my actions might not actually change the problem? And so that's why today I'm going to speak to you about individual responsibility and climate change. By first, I'll be talking about kind of background, why it matters. Second, I'm going to analyze two different approaches from Immanuel Kant and Robert Nozick. And then third, I will be talking about the implications of these approaches, the shortcomings of them, and possible pathways forward. And so in the US, there's kind of, the reason why I chose Immanuel Kant and Robert Nozick is because there's really two big approaches that individuals are given. We're told that our individual actions matter, like recycling, using less plastic, and these sort of duties can fall under Kantian duties from a philosophical perspective, having the duty to engage in behaviors that uplift others. And then the second approach, Robert Nozick, is mainly from a property standpoint, because other solutions we're given are like cap and trade solutions or more market-based property solutions. And so after analyzing these, my main point is that both Kantian duties and Nozickian property rights fall short of being successful guides to individual responsibility in climate change, because both ignore the individual differences in circumstances between different types of individuals. And so this will either be too constraining on too many people or not constraining enough on others. And so this matters because climate change is so complex. And if we just focus on a systemic level, it doesn't really ensure that the individuals who contribute the most to climate change actually change their behavior or pay compensation, or that the individuals specifically most affected actually receive any help. And so this brings me to my first approach, which is the philosophy of Immanuel Kant. And so Kantian duties, he outlines in The Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, his book. He wanted to find a sort of pure moral philosophy that we as individuals can live by to legislate ourselves, free from all human experience. So a priori, duties that follow the moral law. And these duties are intrinsically good in themselves, not based on what they accomplish. And so Kantian scholar John Gilroy, he argues that we have a duty to engage in environmentally friendly behaviors, because if human autonomy is the goal of the moral law, then a precondition to that would be a flourishing environment. So in order for everyone to be fully realized as people, respecting the environment and living in a inhabitable world is important. And so when analyzing this, green actions being intrinsically good in themselves is very idealistic. And when individuals are legislators of themselves, not being seen as instrumentally good, it could just lead to no one really changing their actions, because everyone has different value judgments of what could constitute environmental harm. And additionally, it's very idealistic to assume that in the age of climate change, that these issues could be legislated free from experience, because there's so much human judgment and that would come into an issue this complex. And so the complexities of climate change create different perceptions of what constitutes environmental harm. And all in all, using this Kantian duties approach to individual responsibility for climate change is just too universalized, because it's treated as a one size fits all, when in reality, people have so many differing situations, and people can't have all of the knowledge they would need for this to actually be an effective way to legislate yourself. And so the second approach that I looked at was Robert Nozick, and he creates a Nozickian proviso to guide individuals on when use and ownership of property is legitimate. And so Nozick's proviso is on the use of property and common property. And he says that as long as the situation of others is not made worsened to the point where it would be if there was no private property at all, that your property ownership is just. So that's a little complicated, but he's basically saying that the effects of your property ownership are okay as long as they don't cause catastrophic damage. Now, this requires a lot of assumptions about what a hypothetical private property free society would be. And so in effect, living by this proviso, pollution would rarely be outlawed, and it would only be outlawed in the most catastrophic of cases. However, two different scholars, Woundish and Milburn, they both argue that Nozick's proviso would be violated in the case of people who do not own property and do not have jobs, since arguably in a society where property is common, those people would be better off in that instance. And so we can equate these jobless and propertyless people to climate refugees. And increasingly, there are going to be more and more people affected by these extreme climate catastrophic events that would make property ownership unjust. The issue comes in determining whose ownership is unjust, since these are collective harms. And that is one of the main faults in Nozick's proviso, is that he doesn't specify which individuals would be responsible in compensating these individuals who are climate refugees or affected to this point. Instead, he just says that as long as someone compensates them, property ownership is just. So in effect, using this proviso as a way to legislate yourself, it wouldn't really compel anyone to change their behavior, since everyone would be equally culpable. And it's essentially creating Nozick's value system of what he constitutes as enough harm and pushing it onto everyone else. And so other marginalized groups who don't have the same value systems as Nozick as what constitutes environmental harm would really be left out of this proviso, and it would just perpetuate environmental harms further. And so when looking at the shortcomings of both of these approaches, both Kant and Nozick really create too universal and too vague of guides to live by. And because in effect, they would exacerbate inequalities between groups of different income levels, generations, and geographic locations. Both Kant and Nozick fail to recognize these differences in their philosophy. And so this creates the need for an outlook that doesn't universalize outlook judgments and treat all people as the same, but instead creates more flexibility. And so when viewing the conclusion of this analysis, It really reveals the dangers in creating an environmental guide based off of these rigid value systems. Having a one-size-fits-all will ultimately create too rigid of values for people who either have less power over their situation. And so this begs the question, will it ever be possible to determine individual responsibility for climate change or have a way to legislate yourself? And the way that I answer that is looking for a philosophy with more flexibility that takes into consideration different differences in capability, culpability, and power, and breaking down those boundaries and being more inclusive, and then eventually, hopefully, applying this on a global scale to lead to more of a global justice towards environmental issues. So, thank you.
Yay, awesome. And so I'd like to open up. I mean, I have some specific feedback, but I want to encourage the other faculty that we have on here to jump in and go back through them. I mean, I'm also struck by the fact that, I feel like we always say this at conferences, I'm also struck by the fact that these are 3 really diverse areas and that they are all sharing one thing in common, and that is there is a situation which is changing, and it's how do we better understand that situation given the knowledge that we have. And I think that's part, Cesar, why what you're doing in terms of the history makes it even more difficult. So, you know, just by virtue of that. And so I want to jump in there first, because I was really struck by that. And we're doing a whole bunch of research. I do quantitative stuff on like long-term consequences of prosecutor decisions in cases, but we see religion come up. You will see it come up in cases. So in looking at those histories, have you, and I'm not sure where you went for getting the sort of exemplars that you had used. Have you thought about looking maybe at some of the stories that come out of times, like the personal narratives of people and their encounters with it? Because I bet you if you have, and I'm not sure, I would defer to Professor Tomlin on how you might find them, but I have seen, like, when you read stories of people that were brought in and how they wound up being converted. Any place where you have stories of land being taken, one thing that was a common pattern is you went in, you started the conversion process, and that contributed to being able to take the land. For expanding some of your really great thoughts about that, like how did you find those stories that you used as exemplars?
So that's a good question. For instance, with one of the examples that I had about one of these missionaries who was converting the Native American population in his area, he was speaking in he was speaking for a Native American convert on her behalf, even though, you know, you can see that he's clearly biased about making his efforts look as positive as possible, that he's accomplishing all this these conversion efforts. But, you know, even though that bias exists there, what he admits in his account of what his interactions with these Native Americans were is that in this instance, Mary Doxeter, who that was her new name now as a Christianized Native American woman, she noted how some of her fellow natives were not happy with this whole setup and would rather remove into the forest and not take the land that was being offered by the government and by these missionaries while they were expanding westward. So sometimes you don't find an explicit form of an account from a Native American of, oh, this is how I experienced this and this is what happened. You unfortunately have these guys speaking for them, but seeing those kind of things that they admit, It's like, oh, she told me that, oh, these guys didn't like what we were doing and they left. In there, you see that additional story of where that resistance is going on. And to me, that trail was why I was talking about that implicit form of resistance.
Yeah.
Like you don't initially see, but it goes deeper in there.
But it's there. And one of the things you see is that you anglicized names. It made it easier for documents and to transfer property. It's part of a whole systemic thing. And I'm sure Professor Tomlin has already talked to you about this, but I would encourage you, because this is just really great work. This is really fascinating and not done a lot. The Harvard Project on pluralism has a bunch of different things once you drill into it. And I just think you've really got something going on here with thinking about the different ways. And I would encourage you to start thinking of the different modes of resistance and what might be more effective, because that's something that I would say Lauren has in common with, like, well, how do you make this policy? How do you make stuff effective? How do you make your resistance effective? How do you make policy change something that would be effective? Lauren, a question I would have for you would be, one of the things is, Kant is a little pie in the sky. Nozick is good, but it's still not going to get it there. And in the policy area, one thing that we're kind of obsessed with, if you ask me, is this idea of the policy nudge. And the idea behind a policy nudge is that you give people information and heuristics so that they start to internalize the decision making, so that you try to solve some part of the collective action problem slowly over time by adjusting people's behavior. The most recent example of this, and it failed desperately, and let's face it, straws are not what is destroying the environment. Carbon footprint, right? But the whole business of use your own straw, right? That was a nudge. That was an endeavor to do your little bit in the environment to stop it. And so what do you think that Nozick might say about something like the policy nudge, since he's kind of recognizing there are these value judgments and you might be able to shift some of that?
Yeah, I think Nozick's thought on property and just the value of markets in general, he would probably be a huge proponent of, well, if an issue is bad enough, probably consumer choices over time will be able to correct themselves. And there's enough net benefit in society overall to where it wouldn't really matter. And hopefully that some innovation would come out of innovation through private property would be able to solve that. But I definitely think the slow sort of nudges of consumer choice and the tiny things that we are able to do that might catch on. If everyone slowly stopped using maybe plastic bags at the grocery store, maybe that would have a huge impact or something like that.
Yeah, or how about charging at the grocery store, right? Because nothing hits people harder than in their pocket. And so it's like, oh, sorry, no bags. I mean, that's the Aldi model. And it's part of why Aldi keeps costs low. Yeah, I was really struck by that, and that you don't often hear. I mean, everybody talks about Kant. And so it was really nice for you to kind of take a little bit of that and go, well, let's dig in a little deeper on somebody who might take a slightly different perspective on that.
Although I think, Lauren, I'm sorry, we don't have to, just one comment on that. I think you were trying to show that ultimately these little changes will not actually happen. Change climate, right? Change the big problem. So the issue is actually, well, straws, nice, you change your behavior, but that's not actually going to solve the real problem we're trying to change, right? So trying to understand, I guess first, what is the actual relationship between individual responsibility and this huge environmental problem, right? And then recognizing that the little things you can nudge people to do every day are actually kind of silly compared to the real big picture problem. But I don't know, maybe Lauren, I'm stepping into, maybe you don't agree with me on that.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things. So where I was going to go after the straws was toward Pepsi. Are you guys watching what Pepsi's doing with the bottles, getting them back, and that when you return them, they're sort of doing their own kind of deposit thing again. But that's one more endeavor to try to incorporate the private property component.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for clarifying that, because I wasn't sure. I want to make clear that from his perspective, Nozick's, it has to be something that's going to be grounded in those property rights, because until the property rights and how we view property rights are incorporated into the regime change for the environment, it won't change. Is that correct, Lauren? Am I interpreting that right?
I think when applying like what Nozick would see as a solution to climate issues, it wouldn't go far enough. And so that was the main shortcoming, is that all of the problems we would probably still exist. So
right. So I want to ask you at the end of the day, Kant and Nozick no good? They're worthless to us here. Nothing. We got nothing for climate change.
They can be a rough guide, and I think especially Kant, maybe you can make yourself like feel good about the things you do, but at the end of the day, like it's just too generalized and not really enough of a guide
to be able to help with that.
Yeah.
Esmeralda. So these are some of the things we've talked a little bit, unfortunately, before. Have you thought about how trust might generally run in institutions? And I'm struck by the fact that, again, among all of your 3 papers, you're looking at this idea of somehow how people make decisions regarding their behavior and change that. Have you thought about how maybe that all the people, if you trust the legislature, then you trust the courts and you trust the president, and how might you get at that idea that it's all running together and that's what's accounting for some of your results?
So I think that's what's difficult about this, with like tracing back why you would get public support, and especially with regards to government trust, is that it's almost a little bit circular, because the way for the peace agreement to be successful is for it to have public support. And that's something that's been demonstrated within the literature over and over and over again, both in Colombia and with regards to other conflicts. There needs to be public support to aid the implementation of a peace agreement. But how is the public to trust its government if the government is struggling to implement the peace agreement? And so then it's just this very unfortunate cycle of a lack of trust in the government and some shortcomings with regards to the implementation of the agreement. And so I think that as far as trust between the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary being tied together, I think that definitely does exist. And I think arguably can be related to the trust in elections variable, because the elections would be associated with all 3 branches of government, because with regards to the legislature and the executive on the national level, Colombia does hold elections for those positions. And then as far as the judiciary goes, the 2 presidents that I talked about in my presentation, Uribe and Santos, have both been accused of corruption. And so they would both need to have that litigated within the judicial system. And so then it's a question of whether the judicial system will respond to that. And so then in that way, I think they can all be tied together.
Yeah, we just encourage you to think about we should look at a factor analysis to see if something is loading on a variable. And it might also be because Duque came in and he's basically a rebase person, right? And so there's not really been any kind of true power change that has occurred. But I'm also struck by that for the Farc demobilization, right? You might trust the Farc, but you still think like they're not going to demobilize, because why would you demobilize? Look at Duque, he's crazy. He's part of Uribe's problem, and he's never going to let the FARC get anywhere. So I think maybe a more sophisticated technique to drill into that a little bit more. And also, we've talked about this, like getting a better proxy for like the violence, and whether you are personally affected by the violence as opposed to violence in your area becomes really important. I would like to open it up for other folks to ask questions of each other. Did students have questions of others' presentations, or comments from faculty, other folks that are on here that want to unmute and show yourself, or you don't have to show yourself, but ask a question, please jump in. I love these things because they always make me think about bigger issues.
I believe Dr. Tomlin posted a question to all of us about choosing what data to include and not to. I suppose I'll start on it first. So, you know, the choices that I have to make when kind of telling the story of Native American resistance, like at the beginning, I was just struggling with looking at resistance as a whole. And as I mentioned, at first I had this preconception that it had to be like explicit, it had to be obvious. But then I found that that's too broad, and that might limit a lot of possible routes that I could take. So I ended up figuring out, having that aha moment of, oh, implicit resistance, that's important to this story. And so through that, I found patterns of, you know, analyzing death, analyzing the offensive, analyzing dialogue. But then the problem that creates of being a little bit more specific is that, oh, there's going to be some stories that probably won't fit those categories that you created for your research. And then you find yourself like having to omit them because it doesn't fit the 3 points that I wanted to focus on here. So that's some of the places that you sacrifice, you know, omitting some sources or not. And then just one of the more mechanical things about doing research with primary sources is that sometimes things can be a little bit hard to read. I remember once for one of my sources here with Mary Doxteter, it took me about an hour to read like a paragraph of text in like really a century or two ago letter. And it was like, oh my God, it was like, and it was fun, but also very tedious. So that's another way that, you know, you have to be like, am I really gonna spend the next few days interpreting this entire page? But yeah, that's kind of the choices I made.
Esmeralda, you want to talk about your data choice?
Yeah, so choosing data was actually something that I struggled with a lot, as Dr. King can attest to, especially in the beginning, because I had this feeling of, so I knew that I wanted to explain public support, but I was looking at policing and I was looking at gender inequality, and I was kind of everywhere. And so then eventually it got to a point where it was like, okay, this is a peace agreement. Who is it a peace agreement with? Colombia and the FARC. So what can we do with that? We're looking at the Colombian government, we're looking at the FARC. How does trust motivate the peace agreement? And that's what I eventually landed on. Where I got my data was from the LAPOP survey that was conducted in 2016. And that survey is long, probably hundreds of questions. And so there was a lot for me to choose from, but I felt that choosing variables, all of which are very parallel to each other in terms of what they are asking, because there's a difference between do you trust in the executive and do you approve in the judiciary? You know, those are different questions. So finding those parallel questions between all three branches of government, the elections, and then the FARC. And then I threw in violence because I was interested in victimization, which is something I'd like to continue in further research. And to sort of, I guess, add on to that a little bit, I received a question about not receiving any correlation with the demographic data. I was also struck by that. That was something that was very surprising to me, because for a person to be a more marginalized group or to be in a lower income area, we have we have very good reason to believe that they would have been hit harder by the conflict, because that's where most of the actual conflict was centered, in these lower income and rural areas. But that didn't seem to affect the data much. I think one shortcoming of the LAPOP survey that might play into this is that the LAPOP survey has data primarily from urban areas as opposed to rural areas. So I think further research, if it has better rural analysis, though I understand that that is incredibly difficult, but with better rural analysis, I think we might see more connections. And additionally, with gender, we actually see that women are less likely to support the peace agreement than men are. And that is statistically significant whenever this is run as only between gender and support for the agreement. It's not statistically significant within the entire model now that these other variables have been added, but on its own, that is something that I wanted to explore further, because I think it's very interesting that it sort of subverts these gender roles.
Lauren, kind of a similar question to them. I was struck by why Kant and Nozick? I mean, because Kant I get, Nozick is a little bit sort of different for me. So what framed that? How did those two brothers get joined in this debate?
Yeah, so actually I see Dr. Bork's laughing because finding because I planned on looking at Kant, because there already exists kind of Kantian environmental ethics. It's already very much in depth, but we wanted to find kind of a response to Kant. And so actually Nozick overlaps with Kant in terms of what his sort of morals are based on, because he believes in like the primacy of individual autonomy, and he's all the way with Kant on that. And so I guess it kind of worked out in if individuals are going to be like legislators of their own actions, kind of having that autonomy as the forefront, but also just that they are kind of two dominating approaches in general if you look at, well, individual actions or like property rights. So it kind of worked out.
Yeah, that's great. That's fascinating. And it does make sense if you think of the individual autonomy angle. Esmeralda, there was another question about the survey, the LAPOP survey. So let the LAPOP survey have it. Are we relying on reliable? It's actually not government data, but are these data reliable, right? And do they have structural and social inequalities? I know you can destroy this question.
So yeah, LAPOP, the Latin American Public Opinion Project, is coming from Vanderbilt University, and there are definitely shortcomings to the survey data, especially because, like, as I already mentioned, the urban and rural divide, I think especially with what I've learned about Colombia, there is a very large difference in terms of inequality between urban and rural communities. And it's difficult because to reach these more rural communities takes, I think, likely a lot more manpower, and they may not all speak like a dominant Western language like Spanish, which is what the LAPOP survey is, I think, originally published in. And so there are definitely the shortcomings of the data, but as far as data surveying Latin America and specifically Colombia, LAPOP is the best we have, and it's been relied on in numerous other studies. So I think it would be really great to see more money and resources to be put into the LAPOP survey, so that way they can expand upon it and have a little bit of an easier time reporting. But for now, it's just what we have.
Yeah, that's such a great question. And we're trying to get out into the outlying areas in the Colombian project where most of the violence was. And for that reason, it's exactly that kind of stuff, because those in more rural areas are more supportive of the peace. They're sick of the violence. This is killing them. Everybody's fighting over their land. It doesn't matter if it's the paramilitaries or the FARC or the ELN or the BACRIM, it doesn't matter. So, we are coming up on our time, are we not, Courtney? And if there were any kind of, I think what I'd like each one of you to do is if you would quick say, like, what was a joy and what was a frustration. And this is like the 30-second lightning round, okay? Because it's always important to know, like, what did I find joyous about this research and what did I absolutely hate? Because that's what will fuel your desire to keep moving forward. You're always going to have the hate. Just keep your joy higher. So we'll start off, Esmeralda, with you. 30-second lightning round. What gave you joy? What caused you grief?
So I think what gave me the most joy is what happened just right now, because at the start of this year, I didn't think that this was possible. And if I'm being honest, maybe like a month ago, 2 weeks ago, an hour ago, I was also not entirely sure that this was possible. So I feel a lot of accomplishment. I think what's given me the biggest grief this process has been, I can't answer every question definitively, and that's incredibly frustrating. But what I can do is use these questions that I have remaining as the basis for future projects, which is what I'm very excited for. So thank you.
Awesome. Awesome. Cesar?
Yeah, for me, what was exciting about it was kind of the aha moment that I had of figuring out that there's also implicit resistance existent within these sources that I was looking at. That moment was what was like, oh my God, I can actually do this. I can actually make this argument. And what was frustrating, I already noted, was that 1 hour of time looking at that one source that was barely legible. It was like, okay, all right. That was probably the most frustrating part of it. But yeah, it was a joy.
Cool. Yeah, and actually I would say I tend to pull my hair out like on theory. So Dr. Bork, I will tell you sometimes when I go into reading Kant again, I'm like, oh, you are wearing me out. Lauren, how about you?
I think probably my biggest joy, I really like just thinking about these questions, and I guess through my reading and reading of different people who've also kind of examined these, just thinking through different scenarios and finding like different approaches to questions and like questions beyond those. And I guess my biggest frustration is that that's a whole lot of what theory is, and at some points it's just too much. And especially like reading Kant and Nozick, it's just a lot. But it was a fun process. I learned a lot, so.
It does, and you start to understand why theorists do that kind of line by line analysis. I've never had a lot of patience for it, and I have new appreciation after studying theory. Anybody else want to chime in? Any other, last words? Courtney, anything else you want to say students should do? Y'all, I will say this. Y'all should all be each so impressed. I mean, I'm really, to the faculty mentors that did this stuff, I really appreciate how interesting the research is that your students are doing. That's the best part of doing these panels. So thank you for that. You guys are really good. I really want to encourage all of you to continue